Привет. Сегодня мы рассуждаем.
Australia has 5 times the population and over 10 times the military budget, but New Zealand is behind 1,000 miles of ocean. Australia does have a decisive edge in combat planes and naval assets, and its ground troops are almost 10 times more numerous. If Kiwis don't stop an invasion on the beaches, do they even have a chance? Would New Zealand be doomed against Australia? Watch to find out. Let's get back to the fight down under. As with any overseas invasion, the Navy and the Air Force would be sent out first. New Zealand is far enough from Australia that most of Australian planes can't reach it without in-air refueling. But Australia does have quite a few tankers for the size of its Air Force. Each one could fly to New Zealand and provide enough fuel for over half a dozen Hornets, 2 times. While commercial airliner-based planes have better availability rates, it's still likely 1 or 2 would not be available at any one time. 5 tankers might provide enough fuel for 30 plus Hornets to patrol 2 hours over New Zealand, or enough fuel for some 50 Hornets performing strike missions. That's roughly a third of the entire Royal Australian Air Force combat fleet. Some of the newest F-35s are still in the US, as more crews undergo training. Would those planes meet any resistance? No, because New Zealand does not have a combat air force. All of their planes are for various support roles, maritime patrol and such. Their helicopter fleet is equally utilitarian, with their Sea Sprite helicopters being closest to combat aircraft, as they're meant both for anti-ship and anti-submarine missions. New Zealand used to operate A4 Skyhawk combat planes, but those lost their combat capabilities nearly 20 years ago and were subsequently retired, with their replacements cancelled. Does New Zealand have high-altitude air defenses? The answer is again no. They do have a dozen Mistral launch units, but it's basically a shoulder-launched class missile system. To make matters worse, the New Zealand Army did not really train with them, as it has been stored for a long time. Somehow, when purchased, the Army did not purchase the Identify Friend or Foe equipment with it, so it was never put into proper service. In this case, those would probably still get used, as they would be the only thing New Zealand would have, but results would be disappointing. Perhaps some helicopter or a low-flying transport plane could be hit with them. More potent air defenses could be found on 2 of New Zealand's combat ships. The Sea Sparrow SAM could reach close to 10 miles in altitude and almost 15 miles in range. Compared to the Australian Navy, that force would however be very inadequate. While Australia has the same general class of ships, their vessels have been modernized and carry both better sensors and more weaponry. Australia also operates some diesel-electric submarines. While they had their share of problems, they still are fairly modern ocean-going subs, and even if just half of them are around New Zealand, the local forces would have to be very careful. Using planes and helicopters to try and hunt those subs would likely end badly for New Zealand, with constant Australian fighter cover over the islands. Australia does have a large aerial radar fleet for early warning, which would help with spotting the enemy. Maritime patrol aircraft would do the monitoring over the seas. Basically, New Zealand would likely get blocked, and no planes or ships would be able to reach it without Australia knowing about them first and attempting to intercept them. If international politics allow it, of course, but these kinds of scenarios tend to disregard such politics. Usually such blockades would not be advisable, as they disperse one's forces. But in this case, there would be no threat to Australian ships once New Zealand's anti-ship assets are neutralized or pinned down. Of course, that in itself might take some weeks. New Zealand's ships don't carry anti-ship missiles. That role is relegated to the Sea Sprite helicopter fleet with their Penguin missiles, and those can operate from other ships, not just frigates. Though in reality they are most likely to operate from ground bases to be safe, and not venture far, performing hit-and-run strikes before disappearing back into improvised bases. Australian Air Force would likely have to conduct many recon and strike missions until they find and neutralize those helicopters. While air tankers would help, getting some air bases closer would be even more important. Luckily for Australia, they already have one island fairly close to New Zealand. It would get populated by the military quickly, and its airport would see rapid expansion into an airbase, probably taking days to weeks. Also, turning commercial airports in Tasmania into Air Force bases would help them reach the southern tip of New Zealand as well. Using the 3 large amphibious assault ships, Australia would slowly take away the outlying islands. like the Chatham Archipelago in the east, Auckland Island in the south, and so on. Some islands like the Cook Islands way up northeast do have some degree of independence and are not always considered part of New Zealand proper, but if the rules of the scenario allow it, those would get taken as well. The Canberra-class ships may look like aircraft carriers with their ski-jump ramps, but that feature is a vestige of the original Spanish design. It was deemed too expensive to modify the design when Australia licensed to build their ships. Australia has no planes capable of operating from those ships, though they would get used as helicopter carriers and perform air assaults on islands. All three mentioned amphibious assault ships combined could carry some 3 dozen helicopters, and could disembark at least 2,400 troops, though given the manageable distances to New Zealand, even overloads of up to nearly 4,000 troops might be possible. New Zealand military forces of all three branches in total number some 3 times that figure, with more troops available as reservists. If one looks at just the army, which would certainly be better equipped to deal with the invasion than some supporting Air Force or Navy technicians, the figures look more dire for New Zealand. Australia has several hundred troops in their amphibious battalion, but the army troops, even if inexperienced in such assaults, would be used to increase those numbers. The active reserve in Australian army is somewhat akin to the US National Guard, serving some weeks per year. Australia would likely try to avoid landing on contested areas, which wouldn't be that hard. New Zealand lacks the hardware to monitor the approaches to their islands. Their aircraft that could otherwise monitor the seas would for the most part be either destroyed or in hiding. And there's so much coastline to be covered. Each of the 2 islands is little over 500 miles across. Given the numbers of the New Zealand military, it's most likely Australia would be able to pick and choose an area without too much resistance and make a beachhead there. Actually, first landings may not be on the 2 of the biggest New Zealand islands, but on the smaller islands very close by. The Stewart Island to the south would in particular make a very good springboard, where masses of Australian soldiers could be brought in, and from which various helicopters could operate. Even if New Zealand tried to preempt those with stationing a few thousand troops on those islands, ultimately they couldn't do much. Australian Navy would keep them cut off, and Australian Air Forces would make sure even most of the supplies by air would not reach them. Those islands don't really have the infrastructure to support many troops, so without outside supplies any troops there would be doomed, given enough time. Using smaller landing craft from the islands, coupled with the larger assault ships and all the added army helicopters operating from the islands, the Australian forces would start landing all around the place, cutting out little pieces of New Zealand. Each of the smaller landing craft could carry an Abrams tank or upward of 100 troops. Then, adjusting for the actual resistance on each of those landing points, a few would be chosen as the most prospective ones, and masses of Australian troops would disembark. Attack helicopters could aid in the landings where opposition is met. Australia operates European-made Tiger attack helicopters. Once some airports get captured, additional supplies and hardware might come by airlift. Australia has a decent transport plane fleet. Armor-wise, Australia is far ahead of New Zealand. Even when just 10% of Australian armored vehicles disembark, they would likely outnumber the New Zealand's vehicles, as it's unlikely New Zealanders could get their vehicles to all of the places needed at once. Australia also uses various armored cars extensively, while New Zealand has but a few similar platforms. New Zealand could possibly even have fewer anti-armor weapons than Australia has armored vehicles. Talking about guided ones, there's just a token number of javelins. While there's likely hundreds of short-range unguided rockets such as M72 and Carl Gustav recoil as guns, it's questionable if those would make a serious dent, given that Australian troops would likely be outnumbering the New Zealanders and suppressing those rocket systems. Not surprisingly, artillery and unmanned recon aircraft is another area where Australia is ahead. To sum everything up, New Zealand doesn't stand much of a chance. Of course, various guerrilla uprisings are always likely, and given the 5 million souls living in New Zealand, as well as anywhere between 700,000 and 1.7 million civilian firearms, long-term occupation casualties for Australia might be quite grave. But there isn't much of a question of who'd be the winner. Ever since the end of the Cold War, New Zealand has simply decided a military force is more of a burden and has kept shrinking its armed forces. The actual disparity in gross domestic product, while almost 7 times higher for Australia, doesn't tell the whole story. When it comes to the defense budget, Australia spends roughly 11 times more. New Zealand is simply refusing to invest heavily in the military. Had it somehow kept its defense spending at double the actual rate, this whole scenario would probably be harder for Australia to win. But in reality, New Zealand doesn't expect any real hostility from its neighbor. Hence such unpreparedness and lopsided result. Oh, and before you go, think about subscribing if you like my content. If you want to be notified of my upcoming videos, subscribing is not enough. You also have to click that bell-shaped notification icon. And if you're viewing Binkov on a phone, notifications from YouTube also need to be turned on. Well, that's it for now. Salutations! And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.